Maura, do you want to share your screen or should I share mine? The bulk of the information in the slides is yours, so it might make sense for you to control the pace.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I'm just putting out now in the chat the link to the slides, because some of it I may just talk about quickly and then get rid of it so we can chat, but that way you can go back to it. So Jamiere, do you just want me to start, or do you want to?
No, I can open it up for us. So we are welcoming Maura back to continue our conversations around implicit bias, cultural competency, and how it relates to the work that we do. As you know, we've had multiple of these conversations now over the last year. And as we get close to application review, we wanted to come back to circling to some of the conversation that we had earlier this summer and thinking about how this plays into specifics of looking at applications and making decisions in this process. One of the things I think is really important is after having the conversations with Lynn and Tara about the holistic review and the great work that Michelle did around the personal rating, is thinking about with key changes in our process this year, obviously being test optional, supplements being optional, and all the moving parts happening around COVID, that is going to be key that we read differently, that we take into account the different pieces of the application that we're going to have, and also recognize that some of our applications will just be thinner than what we've seen in previous years, but that doesn't mean we can't do a great job of selecting the best students, that we can't utilize the tools at our disposal to do this, but also remembering some of the key science perspectives and ideals that Maura has introduced to us to think about what we take into account and what we value. And so some of what Maura is going to do is kind of give us a refresher of some of these particular things, and talking about key areas that we have focused on in some of these workshops thus far. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit more about how this relates to our work and bringing back some of the key themes that Michelle brought up in our most recent training and workshop, talking about the personal rating and looking back at some of the examples that we looked at before, but also thinking about how we utilize the way that we're reading and some of the key points that have been made about summarization, the holistic review, and taking some of that into account so that we can do our best job in selecting really great students and do a better job in some of our bin management this year to try not to lose out on some great applicants like we've done in the past. So I'll turn it over to Maura, and you can guide us through the first part of our training and our workshop, and then I'll be back with you a little bit later.
All right, thanks for having me back, everybody. I always really enjoy chatting with you all. I am going to go ahead and share my screen just for the first part. And as someone was saying, it's amazing how the moment between saying I will share my screen and it actually working is like the longest moment in the world. Okay, so hang on one second. It would help if sorry, 1 second. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to I know that many of you have heard me say some of these things before, but I wanted to sort of talk again about some of the similarities between search processes for faculty and what you do in choosing our next group of Colgate students. And I'm in the middle of running some spaced out workshops for search committees who are running tenure stream searches. And one of the things that I do in the first workshop is to kind of have this moment of reorienting ourselves to who we are now and what the pools are that we're drawing from. So for example, I started the workshop by reminding people of information that they had already seen about the race and gender composition of the Colgate faculty at present. And then taking them through some data about how we compare to our US News and World Report competitors in terms of the racial diversity and gender parity of our faculty. And then sort of doing some anchoring of reminding people that, like, yes, our current faculty is about 75% white. And considering that the faculty spans all the way from people who were just hired last year to people who are nearing retirement, it's not surprising in a way, especially given where we are and what kind of institution we have been, that number should be close to this older demographic. But thinking about who we're recruiting from, like even if someone got a couple of postdocs after undergrad, we're usually looking at hiring new faculty between the ages of like 28 and 32. And so like re-anchoring people's sense of what that is like. And then of course, reminding them one of the many reasons why we're thinking about this sort of stuff is how the demographic changes in the country are affecting student populations much more quickly than they've been affecting faculty populations. And so thinking about ensuring that more of our Colgate students have a chance to be mentored both by faculty who are like them in various ways and by faculty who are not like them in various ways, and that every student, whatever their own identity, has both those kinds of experiences. And then we talk sometimes in these group workshops, but sometimes sort of department by department, we talk about things that are going to be challenges to recruiting a diverse pool, and then reading applications in an equitable way, including thinking about how we can mitigate the effects of inequities that we did not create. And I know that this is something that your office is having a lot of conversations about. And so I won't do as much of the geeky science as I've done before, but just sort of fun things to remind people who've heard me on this before, or to give some anchoring moments for people to whom this is new. The way we process information is very holistic, and it's driven by what task it is that we think we're doing at a particular time. And this has all sorts of effects, some of which are very useful, but some of which are less so. And so one example of this is that when the item in the foreground of an image in some way culturally matches our expectations for what's in the background of that image, we are faster at accurately identifying both the foreground and the background, compared to a situation like this, for example. Or if you put that priest on a football field, you'd have the same effect. Similarly, if we have a particular conception of our task, we're quite likely to do only that task and ignore things that we are not primed to think of as relevant. And so I know I've showed this slide before, but I'm such a big fan that if you're a radiologist looking for cancerous nodules in lungs, you're quite likely to miss the gorilla on the CT slide, even though it's much, much larger by far than the precancerous nodules that you are really expert at detecting, even the ones that are right nearby. And the reason for thinking of this, and obviously there's like a big hand gesture here that would have to be filled in by like lots and lots of explanations of the cognitive mechanisms. But the worry is that in general, when someone fits a stereotype for being good at doing some particular thing, everybody is likely to look harder for evidence that that person is in fact good at that thing. Doesn't mean necessarily we're making up the evidence. The evidence might be there in the file, for example, but we look harder for it. And on the other hand, when the person doesn't fit the stereotype for being good at that thing, we're slightly more likely to miss or overlook evidence, even evidence that's right there, that we didn't have to work that hard to find, like that gorilla. We might miss it. And so sort of an example of the kind of thing, and I know that now we're getting into the stuff that you all have been talking about. The next example that I'm going to share, it just struck me as useful, and it came from a recent paper that I was looking at that some of you might have seen because it was referenced in Inside Higher Ed. And granted, it's looking at correlations, not causation, so it can't prove that something a particular school was doing in its admissions policies had a certain effect. It just notices what happens to the classes of students they admit. And they're talking about the way in which holistic review can actually end up reducing the diversity efforts of a school, or reducing, for example, the number of Pell eligible students who are admitted. And given what recently happened to us with US News, we know that that's not something we want to be doing. And the example that they gave, and it sort of crystallized a lot of this for me, is the difference between two ways in which someone might be really good at basketball and have developed, not that they're going to play interscholastically, but that they have athletic skill, leadership skill, etc. And the difference is between a student whose family can afford for them to be in a travel team, even if there aren't sports opportunities right at their local high school. And so then they literally have nameable things, like someone at those games is actually recording the statistics. And so her, she knows what her stats are. And the comparison is someone who takes the responsibility for organizing, like a pickup informal basketball league, and acts as referee and organizer. Those two students, again, assuming we're not talking about someone who's actually going to be on the official intercollegiate team, they have the same skills. Arguably, the person who's doing the refereeing even has maybe more of what the school might want. But it's the student from the wealthier family that has been given the opportunity to have her skills organized, measured, and formalized in a way that's easy for them to document. And then that is what comes to you in your packet of information about the students. And then this is connected to this broader thing about the way in which it's all sorts of things that show up in files before they ever hit our desks or our laptop screens. And all the data that I'm about to share concerns how recommendations are written for grown-ups, so people applying for faculty positions, but there's no reason to think that the biases wouldn't also be present in rec letters that are written for younger folk like students. And this is also one of these things that's useful to point out, that it's not as if like evil men are out there trying to keep women down. Everybody, when writing a rec letter, if the person they're writing for is female, the letters on average tend to have certain features compared to letters that are written for men. They're shorter, they less often contain words like terrific, they more often contain words like hard worker, dedicated. They talk more about teaching than about research. And at schools like Colgate, that could be a problem because you need to talk about both. And even when you control for things like how many papers did the person publish, the rec letters still show this effect of the sex of the person for whom the letter was being written. And so there's some great examples from a study at the University of Michigan where they actually pulled actual content from, these are letters that faculty are writing for applicants for faculty positions at Michigan. And they include things like, of the 3 Indian ladies we have here this year, she is perhaps the best. Over the past few years, she's learned to balance her intensity with more fun. These things that sort of make your eyebrows grow up. Sorry, not grow up, go up. If you look towards the bottom, where there's a yellow highlight, it's talking about the presence of standout words like brilliant, terrific in a letter. There's a list of how they coded a bunch of those words. And the trouble is that it's not just students in a Psych 101 class who are the usual subjects of almost every psychological study, but it's grown-ups, you, me, us, who show this effect. It's been replicated pretty strongly that when a letter contains fewer of those words like brilliant, terrific, faculty rate the person as less qualified, even when you're controlling for like the number of publications that the person has. So we're affected by these things that we can't control that come across our desks, right? The same way that you can't control what the guidance counselor writes, but you might still be affected by it when it's coming into your head. And so the main thing, and you've heard me talk about this before, that everybody who works on cognitive biases, both the ones that are connected to race and sex, but also the ones that are just connected to like, did you read it first? Did you read it last? Were you tired? Were you caffeinated? All that stuff. People emphasize the importance of accountability and elaboration, that you're going to know in advance of reading, that you're going to have to articulate your response, and you're going to have to articulate it to someone else. And that's the beauty of your paired reading system. And there's lots of evidence for this. I've talked before about jury pools, but there was a recent elegant study in Italy looking at high school teachers who were grading the essays of students in their high school classes. And then you could look at the grades the student got and you could compare them to the scores they earned on a national exam. And you would more or less expect, obviously there's some differences, but that on average you would think the high scoring from the teachers should be getting high scores on the exams, right? And the teachers were often undergrading students who had fairly recently emigrated from North Africa or South Asia to Italy. Their scores on the exams were higher than what the teacher's grading would predict, right? So there was some anti-immigrant bias going on in the grading of the exams. But if you told the teachers about this fact, their grading in subsequent grading cycles more closely tracked the scores that the students eventually got on the exams. Now, you could argue you would need to do a lot more work to show exactly what had happened, but the implication is simply knowing that your own process might not be working well is for many people sufficient to get them to do what they intended to do all along, which was to grade the work fairly. Okay, so the difficulty, though, is that you have to be willing to say things. You have to articulate, here's why this file struck me this way. And when you can see that your reading partner is coming at it like this and you're still thinking like this, you can't just shut up at this point. You have to be like, but wait a minute, I don't understand, or here's what I think. And you have to articulate the reasons behind your thinking. But precisely because what you all are doing can't be outsourced to a computer, right? If we wanted to admit our classes in that boring algorithmic way, and thank God we don't, then there would never be any disagreement about how to apply even the quite detailed rubrics that I know you all have talked about and that Michelle and Jamiere have done workshops on. But because you're not doing a computer-driven algorithmic process, even when you have detailed rubrics and detailed conversations, you may disagree with your reading partner. And that's actually probably a good sign, because it means that you're not thinking about this as an office, as if we could just get rid of all of you and replace you with a computer program, right? You're actually thinking about like what's meant by this, et cetera, et cetera. But that does mean that you'll have tricky conversations and you won't always agree. And there may be like some reasons that are harder to articulate than others. And my last kind of slightly joking, but not really joking slide is, hang on one second. It's again, that incredibly long moment before the share. So the philosopher Immanuel Kant, Colgate Philosophy Department t-shirts say we read Kant so you don't have to, and I fully support that idea. But he has this great moment in one of his books where he's talking about the fact that you can't, at the end of the day, do everything in terms of rules. He's talking about a logic textbook, but it's true for anything, right? If you have a rule, you still have to figure out how to apply it, right? That's like why we need a Supreme Court and not just law. And at the end of the day, he says you can't teach application, or what he's calling judgment, if what you mean by that is give people another list of rules to memorize. At the end of the day, you need what, and this is a direct translation from the German, is called motherwit, like common sense. And if someone doesn't have it, you can't send them to school and make it better. But what you can do is you can train it. And he says such sharpening is the benefit of examples. The idea is that, oops, sorry, that was a mistake. If you give people examples and they work on them, they're like literally training their motherwit, like their ability to go from the rule book to the actual case. Because you couldn't possibly, right? I mean, and I know Michelle and Jamiere have done so much great work to take the personal rating rubric and try to be like, look, here's a non-exhaustive list of what this might mean. Think more expansively. But you could never have a rubric that would enable you to take an application and just in an algorithmic way decide how to score the student, unless the rubric was literally just about that single student. But you need to read a lot of applications, right? So you're always going to be using your judgment. And my sort of final closing thought is like, just own that. Like, that's not a bad thing. What's bad is people using judgment and not being thoughtful about it. Like the example from that paper of the person who maybe isn't thinking about the difference between whose parents can pay for travel basketball in a time of COVID and whose parents can't. judgment is not the enemy. It's being thoughtless while exercising judgment that is the enemy. So that's sort of my like pep talk, and I say this as someone who's very conflict averse, but talking about your disagreements with your readers and expecting to have them seems to me to be a sign of a really good process, right? The only situation in which that would not be happening is where your office had sort of stupidly decided on a algorithm for admitting people, in which case you should all just be fired, or somebody is so afraid to speak up that whatever their reading partner says, they just say, oh, that's great. In which case, why bother doing paired readings at all? So that's it from me. And Jamiere is much faster at screen sharing than I am. I am impressed.
No, I just cheated and did it while you were talking, but I think you already alluded to some of this and how it translates to us. And I think one of the things you look at the committee-based review process or committee-based evaluation is obviously a key part of this is for us to be efficient and to try to make our process that much faster. And that's valuable, but I think as Maura alluded to, there's a lot more to this that adds to the reason why you want to read in this way. And I think in particular, as we think about our own implicit biases and our own individual kind of backgrounds and what we bring to this experience, it's an opportunity to work with someone else. And obviously, as you being the person who's reading the students from your areas and the places that you travel to and that you have an already developed relationship with and understanding, that point of view is really valuable when we think about the context aspect of understanding the schools and communities that you're going to be reading for. But also having someone that's working from outside of that lens and bringing a different perspective is really useful as we think about understanding the wider process of who we want to bring to Colgate. But as Maura said, we ultimately have to challenge one another for this to be the most effective. And one of the things that I think we have to get comfortable with to some degree in these conversations, both as we work as a team, but also as we get forward to thinking about reading applications, is the ways to be able to do that so that we're effectively assessing applicants, but also keeping the best students around and making sure we don't lose out on the opportunity to be able to bring the best students to Colgate, but also in a year where everything's going to be so different in how we review what information is available to us as we continue to change this process, nitpicking at not what is wrong with applicants, but finding those things that we can really be excited about and having those conversations with one another and making these decisions. But ultimately, it does come back to the idea of practice. And so remember the examples that we've already talked about earlier and that Michelle focused on when we were talking about the new personal rating. And understanding that within each of these particular examples, we were having to have some really tough conversations to decide, well, how do we rate and how do we score the student? And there were some differences in those conversations, but we were all able to come to a place where we were able to say, well, this feels more like this number versus that number. And also remembering that we have the new non-applicable category, not because we want to have a cop-out to not give students scores, but there will be cases where there's just not that information for us to know how to best score a student. But ultimately knowing that the descriptors, the summarization, that conversation piece, and giving a good overview is going to be really key for us, especially this year, as we try to think about truly doing a better holistic read, but also being able to move students through the bin process as we come back with second readers or potential third readers and have more people involved in the process so that we're not constantly having to pull students out of one bucket, bring them back to the original readers to have a conversation around why you put this there. But if you're giving really good feedback and working with the person who you're initially reading with, being able to come to a good consensus and a good idea of what each of these particular categories mean, and thinking about the fact that in some of these cases, it's just going to be hard. And there aren't going to be those hard and fast rules as Maura talked about, because this is a human process. And the human element and what you bring to this conversation is really key. Or we could just run an algorithm and just select our students without thinking about how that impacts our community, the type of environment that we want to have, and the mission and values that we're putting in place as an institution and as an office. As we move forward and continue to kind of reevaluate and recontextualize our own process. So Don't forget these examples. Don't forget the fact that Michelle did a really great job of giving us subcategories of examples to choose from and look at as we're making these determinations, but ultimately it's not exhaustive. There are only so many examples that you can think up in your head, so many different cases that you can run through, and there's always going to be that scenario of this is completely different than anything we've looked at or anything that we've seen before. And that doesn't mean that that student doesn't fit within a high score in a category. It just means you and your partner are going to have to think very intentionally about where they fit within that rating scale, and understanding that we want to be as fair and as equitable in this process as possible. But a couple of things I wanted you to also consider is when we're looking at the review process, and one of the things that has been talked about by the application team and looking at last year's process in particular, were there students where us being slower in our process, and I mean students that we move to waitlist or committee, students that we miss out on? Or are we sending students to the waitlist or deny bin that actually don't deserve to be there? And are we not considering the bigger picture when we think about how we move students from that initial review into the next stage in the process? And in particular, thinking about students from the most underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, students who are rural, low income students, students who have had non-traditional experiences for whatever reason, do we end up placing them in waitlist or deny and lose out on them because as we're funneling through trying to figure out where they fit in our process, they're getting admitted somewhere else. And they have other opportunities that are really great for them. And Colgate just never gets the chance because we didn't quite get through our process. Or are we being unfair and unequitable in terms of how we're really communicating what we're doing here? If we're saying we're going to be holistic, we're going to change the way we review applications and really be diligent in thinking about keeping the best students regardless of where they're coming from in our process, are we truly doing that? Are we admitting all of the best students? Are we admitting the students from a diverse background? Or do we end up reverting back to certain traditions and ideals that this place has stood for in the past? And then later we're coming back and we're having to fill in our class with students that we're not as excited about. I know that's been part of the conversation as well. So when you think about it, consider, are we being too slow? Are we moving the wrong students into waitlist or deny? And ultimately, do we miss out on these great students because they're going to have other options and they're going to be competitive? And while on paper, there may be things that maybe you're worried about or things that you're questioning, part of the conversation in a holistic review is taking into account all of the different factors in that application that we can be excited about. And the opportunity for us to be able to communicate why these students should be here more so than looking for reasons to be able to quickly get through an application, send them on to deny and move on to the next one, and realizing when we look back at the class, this isn't the group that we really wanted to bring here. So really important conversations to have internally, important conversations as you're thinking about reviewing with your partner throughout the process that we need to be concerned with, but also just understanding at the end of the day, as we talked about last week, it means changing the way that we review and how we think about this process a little bit. I know Mari brought up the idea of feeling a little bit hesitant about the not applicable because that could be viewed as a negative, but it's not. It's designed for us to be able to do our process a little bit differently and not just score everybody a 2 or a 3 because that's what we've always done. And so this is an opportunity for us as we go through these different trainings, these different workshops. We're going to come back and look at more of these examples for the personal rating and other parts of the review for us to just get more comfortable and get a little bit better at doing things a little bit different. So as we talked about, as I was alluding to, kind of bin management and decisions, obviously, as I said, being careful about who we move to deny and wait lists, what students we're thinking about, but also considerations of academic rigor. I think one of the questions we can think about is the amount of weight we placed on advanced courses versus thinking about students who are just taking a full curriculum, and accounting how we think about the value of honors, AP, and IB, not because they're not important, but understanding that some students aren't going to have access to those particular courses. And as well as in a year that everything is so different that transcripts are just going to be different for us in thinking about what senior grades will look like and how students are dealing with COVID and how different school systems are managing the process. And I know we're optional this year with senior grades, but a lot of students are still going to submit them and give us that information. And so thinking about how we utilize and think about rigor and how students have prepared themselves and what intellectual achievement really looks like in both traditional and non-traditional forms, and being generous and flexible in how we have these conversations as well. So A lot of information covered there, both from Maura's perspective and also thinking about our review process. Are there any particular questions that people have, thoughts, as we think about how this impacts how we're going to review this year, or any just overall thoughts or concerns that you'd like to bring to the group?
Thanks, Maura. Thanks, Jamiere. This isn't necessarily a question. I think it's just more a comment, and maybe it just needs to be a comment. I'm still trying to process my a potential bias I feel for myself in this process around equitably reading students that did not receive grades in the spring and may not choose to submit grades for the fall because of a decision or a structure of their high school, and how I can objectively review that, similar to a student who may have gone to a high school that administered grades in the spring and that chooses to submit grades for the fall. I believe in the decisions we've made, but I think personally, for me, I've been able to move past the test optional. Like, I'm good with that. You know, I think I can put that in its place. But when we talk so much about rigor in academic performance and what performance means, all of the other qualities of maturity and organization and some of the other things that come with that, I'm struggling a little bit as we prepare for this big change of the disruption of education, how to put that in perspective, when that is really a cornerstone of how we move students through the process. So again, just maybe a self-proclamation of what's keeping me up in this process, but I think our applicants are going to look very different with the academic information that they present, and how we not bias a student because of that. So.
I have a quick technical question, and then, but is it even possible in your system, like the way the applications look, how much of a student's file could you read without seeing their grades?
Well, we read it in sections. So, and people do things differently. And in the team read model, one person typically does the personal. So there is one person who's reading the application and the essays and the recommendations. And I've toyed with this, like, everyone be quiet until the end. You know, because there's one person reading just really more of the personal. The individual can self-report on the application, a GPA, a place in class. But on the academic side, doing the academic review piece, that individual that's a primary review that they're doing.
And you obviously can't see like what they took without seeing their grades, because you're like looking at a transcript. Okay.
Right.
I'm asking just, and then I'll shut up because this is really not a question for me, but there is
no, I mean, I think let's challenge each other to think about different ways to do this, because this is what we need.
Because it's so tricky, right? Because it's like, I know on the faculty side, there's been an issue where, like, if a department in the past would say you could submit up to 4 letters, and then it's sort of like, some people have 3, some people have 4, and sometimes the 4th letter is horrible and sometimes it's wonderful. And like, knowing how to be equitable when you have different amounts of information is a huge thing.
Yes.
And then also the things that the candidate can control versus what they can't to some extent. And Rebecca Metzler and Linda Tseng in the physics department, because they were worried about lots of data around equitable access to mentoring in physics PhD programs in particular, they lobbied to have their department, when they did a tenure stream search last year, that they had the AA in their department pull all the files and put just the teaching statement and the research statement, which in physics is like, they're both pretty long. They're like a like description of sort of everything you have done and plan to do, but it's not your CV and it's not your cover letter. So it doesn't say where you came from or who your supervisor was. And they read those first without knowing the names of the candidates. And they ranked them based just on that. And then they read rec letters and CVs and were very surprised at how that step didn't really change the initial assessments. And they ended up with a much more diverse initial cut pool of about 25 people to think about interviewing than they had in past searches. I'm just sort of, yeah, so I mean, I'm just throwing that out there as like, I realize you're not going to redesign your entire bin system and you wouldn't want to necessarily, but just like, because they were worried about how CVs in particular, seeing where someone had published, which in the sciences is very dependent on, at least at that stage, basically what kind of relationship you have with the person running your lab and not necessarily your own talent. They were just worried about how that was going to affect them. And so they suppressed their access to that information, not forever, because that information is relevant, but long enough to find some of the people who they were just like, oh my gosh, did you see this innovative teaching proposal from number 3, 4, 5? And then they saw, you know, other stuff about 3, 4, 5. Yeah.
Maybe Lynn, something that is an easy change that could possibly encompass your concern with, you know, again, fairly evaluating, you know, the students on that academic piece, just given how different everything else is going to be. Like you said, we read in 2 different groups, and, you know, one of us is primarily looking at the personal, the other's looking at the academic. Maybe it's just a matter of, you know, when we come together after reading both sections, you know, depending on who you're with, it might be like, oh, you know, I was filling out the reader form, so here's the academic information to put in it. Maybe it's us just saying the first conversation you have after that reading period is about the personal. The first aspect is covering that, so that that conversation has been had before you jump in. Because I found last season with some of those instances where, you know, maybe I was not, it wasn't my file, so I was on the personal, and we started with that. I'd give these glowing reviews of this great student, and then the response might be, yeah, they actually sound really cool. I'm a little concerned because their testing is blank or their senior grades look like blank, but it sounds like there are a lot of pieces that you like. And then that kind of shifted the way the conversation went. And if we're looking to be, you know, if we're looking for something that's a bit more constant between the academic and the personal is probably going to provide us with a little bit more constants. So maybe it's just a matter of us saying, in general, the personal is the first topic of discussion once the 2 groups have gone into it. And honestly, at that point too, you know, the person who's done the academic probably hasn't even looked at the personal yet, so that can give them a chance to look through. Because the other thing I found last season was, if it was my file and I was doing the academic, I didn't really know much about the personal beyond the few notes that my partner read. So maybe that's an opportunity to check biases and have that person whose file it is go through as the person's giving the summary. So that might be something to do, but again, you know, that's just one suggestion. I know everybody has their own style, so.
No, that's great, Brittany. I appreciate that.
I think kind of in a similar vein, the first thing I thought about is the fact that we got done a huge favor by Common App and Coalition by breaking out a space for students to talk about COVID in particular, and not having a whole bunch of essays that end up coming in about the COVID experience. And so I think that, plus I know a lot of counselors are talking about how to update their school reports to include anything specific to what that school has done or how it's impacted their process as well. So in addition to thinking about just the personal as it involves the student, if there are particular things that stand out about how COVID impacted that school, or how the student talks about their experience as related to COVID, those might be great things to lead with as well. And the fact that we're also going to have the opportunity for the student to talk about something else and not have COVID be the central part of their personal statement or other essays necessarily. When we're thinking about the personal side, I think that was a huge benefit to us who are doing a holistic review, because it gives us a chance for the student to talk about how did this particular thing that's really huge to what's going on in the current impacting you, but are there other things that we should know about you as well? But also for a lot of schools, utilizing one another as resources to think about how they provide good information about what they're doing differently as it relates to COVID or updates that they've made in this particular year that might be unique, especially for schools that we're familiar with. I think those are valuable things to bring into the conversation as well that can help you kind of jumpstart with the personal information to kind of set the tone around what you're seeing on the academic side.
Can I say, is there research around, because I would guess it's not demographically neutral who chooses to disclose or not disclose when that's an option. So like there's students who don't have grades at all to disclose because their school decided to like not release them. But so imagine students who have grades and they're deciding whether they release them or not. I'm just thinking about the difference between someone who's sort of a perfectionist and doesn't have a good mentor and has an A- average and it's like, oh, phew, I don't have to disclose. They won't realize I'm only an A- student, versus the person who's like, I'm really proud of my B pluses. Like, I just, like, I worry about, I mean, this is why the worry, Lynn, that you're raising is so serious and hard to address. Is there research about who tends to disclose in these circumstances and why? Brittany's saying yes. And then how do you avoid making inferences about whether, yeah, like how do you avoid making an inference about why someone didn't disclose?
I didn't have any research, but I was agreeing with you. Because part of my concern as well is, you know, if we have a student who, I think sometimes people don't recognize what they're able to do. So they might be told in their public school, you can choose not to disclose your grades, but they know all their peers and everyone, your older siblings did it, so they feel like they have to, and they're providing us with their B's, versus maybe a student who has a one-on-one counselor, and that counselor sits down with them and says, you did not do very well in COVID and it's not your fault, but let's keep these on the DL. And, you know, maybe that student had some important academic information that they're disclosing. So I didn't have any evidence per se or research, but I was just agreeing with that concern. And it's what's going to make, I think, us as regionals, I think it's going to be important for us to be aware of what our schools did and how, in general, the counselors feel their students managed during this time, because I've had very different conversations from school to school of, no, our students did great virtually, or no, our students did terribly. So that's kind of a weird balance to strike, but I wish I had some data for you. I'd love to provide it.
Well, I think too, some of that, and this is something that I get concerned about too, is students feeling like they should send their grades in because applicants from the past have done it, and they know the kinds of grades that applicants from the past have gotten, and because they know that, you know, Jimmy Smith last year got in and sent in grades and had 2 B's and the rest A's, that it's pretty similar to what Prudence has, and she's going to send hers in. But at the same time too, I mean, I'm just thinking about this, and some of other relevant work that we're doing right now is trying to correct some of that behavior too, and saying like, what are some of the, like in the past, applicants that we've accepted that we probably wouldn't want to per se in the future, and how can we kind of correct that behavior in a year that there's a lot of unknowns. And so I feel like there's a lot of battles in a sense that we're trying to fight, and showing to students that like they don't need to submit this if they don't want to, but they feel like they have to because their friend did, and a lot of it feels really touchy, surrounding a lot of issues about that. And that's something I definitely worry about in my region, given that I have a lot of feeder schools in my region and a lot of well-connected people within my region too, and it's tough.
Yeah.
I mean, the hope is that long term we can shift that dialogue a little bit. Transition years are always tough, and it's coming in with just a lot of fluctuation in the process. But if we continue to really encourage individuals to challenge themselves in high school, you know, with balance, but to take a very strong and rigorous course curriculum. Right now, I think even that message is sending a lot of rub, you know, because we say to students, like, take the most rigorous curriculum, but you really do need to get A's as well. So, right. You know, I think ultimately, you know, when we think about, you know, part of it is COVID and transition of schools this year, but part of it is if this is something that we want to do in a longer term model, this is a really positive message to send to students if we're giving them, you know, an opportunity to say, you know, make a choice, but we care a lot about rigor, then that's a really good message to send to students as there is a lot of pressure and expectation. And we've used those senior grades in a lot of situations. I'm looking at Brittany with her Long Island kids who take 6 APs and they pull up a lot of B pluses, and we're like, oh man, they got B pluses. And it's like, but they have 6 APs. So, you know, I think it's an opportunity for us this year to sort of reframe the conversation. And I think the level of dialogue we're having around this is really great. And it is a very important opportunity for us, Mari, to sort of shift that conversation and to do that well. And I think we're in a position to do so as long as we continue to have the dialogue and make sure that individuals are really comfortable with our direction in the conversation. But there are a lot of moving pieces right now. And I think as we spend more time on high school visits and talking to counselors, it is just very, very, very clear just that the high schools really are truly all over the place in terms of what the student experience is this year. And I do want to say thank you. Speaking of schools, I have a visit in like 4 minutes. So I'm going to sign off and log into another platform. So.
I think in that same vein too, though, one thing that high school counselors have expressed to me, and one thing I feel confident in, is that we are pretty transparent about our process and how much effort we put into understanding our process ourselves so that we can educate others about it. And I think that's something that I've, for the first time in my professional career, felt confident about saying, like, we are holistic in our approach. And it's a conversation that I was having with Lynn a couple of weeks ago, is like, we're holistic in our approach. And I don't know that I've ever felt completely comfortable saying that and meaning it. And now with the changes that we've been making, there's still a lot of improvements we can be making, which is why we continue to have these conversations. But I truly do feel more confident in being able to say that to counselors and students, and like also back it up and say, here are X, Y, and Z why we are holistic. And I think this year I'll feel even better about it. I don't know, maybe we'll see. But I hope to feel even better about it and having those conversations. And it'll be interesting to see, like, because even when I've been doing case studies, I don't know if others have felt this way too, some of the things that other college reps will say are kind of like striking and alarming to me. And I'm like, whoa, like, I don't know that I would ever A, say that, and B, this feels like a completely biased thing to be saying right now. And obviously you don't want to like check a other colleague in front of students, but there have been a couple of times where there've been other reps that I've been like, I don't feel comfortable presenting with you because your process is this way, and you're saying something that is pretty alarming in certain situations. I don't know if others have had that same situation, but it makes me very grateful for us to have these kinds of conversations.
Anybody else? Thoughts, questions, interesting anecdotes? Well, if not, Maura, thank you again for joining us. I think the last thing I would say is I agree, Maura. I think our process continues to improve. I think there's a lot that we can still do in adjustments and thinking about how we keep a lot of great students around, especially as we continue to widen the net of students that we're communicating with. Are we like actually providing the infrastructure that some of these students that we're reaching out to can really be competitive in the process, and what can we do to find other reasons to admit a student? Or are there other ways that we can communicate with students about how they might fit here? And I think the big conversation continues to be not only what we're doing, but how do we transition them into an environment and a community that allows them to be successful and get the most out of being here? Because ultimately, we can admit as many great students from as many places as we want, and they may not choose to come here. And at a point, we have to start to understand why and adjust what we're doing on the other end of this process to get them here. And so I think those are things that go beyond just what we do on our team. But I think part of the conversation we can have is thinking about, well, what can we communicate? How can we promote this place? How do we advocate for certain kids in the process? And then what can we do to entice them, encourage them to come and be a part of it? And I think those are big questions to ask and a lot of things to be done. But I think the fact that we're continuing to evaluate at least the initial part of getting students through the door is valuable. But I think we also have to continue to challenge ourselves and challenge each other to just read differently and take into account some of these conversations that we're having to get the most out of a holistic process, whatever that means for us. So keep that in mind, continue to ask yourself really tough questions, and be prepared because the QuestBridge applications are coming in like 2 weeks. So get ready, everyone, and thanks so much for your time and energy. Maura, I appreciate you always coming back, and
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Feel free to let us know if you have questions.
Bye, you all.